How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Eulier Gonzalez here. So let's take a look now at this particular topic of state lifting state up, the exercise, and a quick recap of how do we get here, so we can move on to the model 3, right? So over the past videos and from these models and for this course, uh, based on the sorry, based on the Josh Kamua experience, a software engineer that has previously worked at Khan Academy and then at Gatsby, right? So in the first model, it is important, at least to us, because this is how the mind is seduced and how the mind responds, is to stories. And well, in order to understand something, so a story is a good mechanism. It works. So in the model 1, we first look at, in model 0, we first look at how the minds might learn, right? Or some studies that describe about that, right? So one of them is the error promotion or error correction, which is something that is go beyond the scope of today's video, but there is a link that I can leave on the description. And the other is, well, how this is another technique, all right, that is interleaving and blocking, all right. So you go from one particular model and then you go to another one, and then you switch back and forward of more related model of knowledge, okay, of course. But I do think that at the end of the day, if you don't have the desire of that, if there is no that intention, that sincerity for yourself to learn, no matter which technique you're going to apply, it won't work. That's why I put myself out there here to recording this series of videos in order to truly understand this, because I do think, and I most likely is that I feel this more like thinking. It's more like feeling. And I know that for people that are logical, that may sound counterintuitive, but in this case, the feeling is because there's some stuff that you need to do, that if you don't do that, you don't like you're not gonna like the consequence. One, and second is that that somebody else tell you that you have to do. For example, well, understand React, understand JavaScript, understand how the things work. So if you need, and if you're going to provide this service to somebody else, so any of the SMB, small to medium business, or to SaaS or any other huge applications or companies, well, it is important for you to understand how these things work, right? And then you're going to decide what to do next, right? If you want to apply to your life or not, you see value applying to your life, to learning how the things work. So in any case, in model 1, we look at why React emerged. Shen was a software engineer. I think she is currently a software engineer, as in a software engineer in how do you Meta, formerly Facebook, to describe what was the problem that they have, right? Is that how we can now is giving a particular state sync across different UIs, all right? And by looking at this particular problem, what they have, and I'm going to mention what was that. You can take a look at my notes to do so. But the thing here is that specific problems that Facebook has is because they want to now is serve content and provide interactivity to the web. And what happens when you want to do that for different platforms? For example, like now the web LG or the native applications, right? So that's why we have now React Native, where it has now a set of well-defined UI tags that now target a specific UI element on those platforms, the iOS, the Android, the Windows Phone, right? And also that we also, in order to now render things in this 3D space, well, we can work it with this particularly primitive that's quite different in other environments. So, for example, in Web 3GL or in Web WebGL, we now have this different primitive, for example, like camera, and among others. I don't remember because I don't have experience, but I definitely want to go into that path at some point. So in any case, so this is the different platforms that now we can use React. And also we look at how can we create React, what is React doing at the end of the day, which is describing is the UI at that particular moment, which is great. So for HTML tags or for native inputs and also for the WebLG, each one of them now React what it's doing is describing is the current state of that. So in the case of the web, which behaves somewhat similar as the mobile, here what we're gonna do is to create now an element and then describe that, and when you call that function you're going to return a object. Okay, so because this can be quite lengthy and verbose, we say, hey, you know what, let's go to is make our life much more simple when it comes to describe all of this UI in JavaScript by using now this language or the syntax here, the GSX. Okay, so we also look at the what GSX, what is the transpilation, what is the difference between transpilation and compilation, and also is how can we now is convert that GSX or what is the difference between the JavaScript, between the HTML, as well as the template engines, and also look at an example of what GSX looks like. And then how this new way of defining our UI, which is in a component base. What is a component? The anatomy is a component. So for example, like the props and the children that it receives at runtime, okay? And also how we can now rendering a collections of elements and some specific elements or some gotchas here with GSS, which is the white space and the React fragment, which is allow us to now is define a set of tag without polluting the DOM. In other words, without having to define nested or root div elements to actually now put a set of HTML tags. So, and also how can we conditionally rendering elements? So far so good. It's like, hey, we're gonna do this whether it's using an if statement or a AND expression or ternary operator or using a CSS class, right? to display or not these elements as conveniently. And why we use CSS to do that, because uh, unfortunately browsers right now they're not good at providing hints to assisted technologies. So this is a much more straightforward and browser safe way to do that. And also is the CSS models. So with CSS model, we now first look at how CSS, and there is also a particular course that we can take a look at that, of the CSS, but I'm not going to dive deep into the detail, so good. But CSS at the end of the day, allow us is to well describe is the layout of this element, and these components here, because traditionally we have now certain way of how to organize our classes and selectors on the styles, which is the bend methodology. Right now we use is the CSS model, because now it encapsulates the style sheets and then expose that selectors, the CSS selectors, so we can have access in the exactly, so we can have access in our component, in our function. And all of this wiring things happen is at build time. Happen is when your code is now transpiled and then bundle up, ready to be used. And it's in that process, which is usually rely on Webpack or any other web model bundler, okay? It's in that process is when now it is being created. And I find that out that is quite interesting, and understand also how this little details works, because it tells you why we're doing this in the first place and how the things work. So it can give you now a huge so it can open up your mind about it, and how you can also implement some sort of solution if you need to do that. In any case, so model 2 here we're working is with events and states. And first look at now how on the events we traditionally respond to user inputs or to user events, because now the browser exposed that, and you can think of this like a mini private investigator that track every little thing that you do, so be careful with that. And so the way of how we can attach some elements or respond to user event is first you get that element, and then you define and then you attach a functions to a particular event listener, all right? And the other is that you just at that particular HTML paste it or call that function, right? But in the case of React, here on the component we just pass a reference function to that event listener, okay? And we can think of that how that things works behind the scenes. So the TLDR of this is that this is how we can respond to user events. And I do find that out, which is quite convenient to read about this, you know? Or at least get a sense of how now and how now is being done here, right? So far we have looked at describing the UI, right? Pretty much that, okay? And then adding interactivity, which is how do we respond to event, and how do we now is keep track of a state change or state with these particular hooks, all right? using now the use state. And when it comes to add now this interactivity, how the things actually works. So we have now is defining is the state, a component's memory. Okay. This is in Spanish. Why this is in Spanish? Colvin. Martin Colvin Andrade. Who are you? Oh, a Chilean sculptor. What? What? That wasn't expected. That wasn't expected. Okay. Sculptor by Marta Colvin. Instituto de Neurocirugía, Providencia, Santiago de Chile. Oh, look at you. Himno al trabajo. Oh, grab. Madre Tierra. That's quite interesting. National Art Prize in 1917 in recognition of her work. Look at you. Interesting. A James Colvin of Irish descendant and Elvira Andrade of Portuguese descendant. That's quite interesting. Okay. Chilean. That was very unexpected. Okay. Holy hell. Holy hell. Okay, that was quite bad. Okay. 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 That's interesting. Although Colvin is predominantly known for abstract themes that allude to pre-Hispanic symbols. This gigant sculpture, an homage to neurosurgery, is one of the most recognizable public art pieces. Okay, that was very interesting that they expose that. Okay. Anyway, okay, Marta Colvin Andrade. Colvin Andrade is interesting that mix, Portuguese and Irish. So yeah, holy moly. So here we're describing is this user state, right? So what this particular thing is doing behind the scenes, right? So anytime that you now use an state, is going to now trigger is a rendering. So in other words, rendering here in the React sense means not to take unprocessed raw data and generate a ready to be used output. It means to spot the difference between different description of the UI, aka JSONs. So JSON that describe is the UI. So because if there is no different, all right, so there is no going to update the DOM here. But the point here is that This user state that is describing now is this internal mechanism of how now you can provide interactivity to that, is that anytime that you now update that state that this hook give to you as well as a setter function. So when you update that state, React we're going to now is detect which components trigger that state, and therefore now re-render that component, aka call the component to generate is the JSON that contains this new version of the UI. And if that component contains more React elements, it will continue to call them until there is no more elements there. So now once it creates this representation, this JSON nested structure, aka the virtual DOM. So once it creates this, now it's going to spot the difference between the previous snapshot that it has and this new snapshot, all right? And then with a surgical precision update the elements or the properties in the DOM, and when that happens, the browser detects those changes and update is the UI that match that, right? So this is the process that happened. And this process can be described as what happened when you mount the application, and once that it's mounted, what happened when you trigger is a re-render that is passed through now the render phase, and then the commit, which one is going to apply those changes to the DOM. So this particular workflow, which is specific to this particular state, the use state, when you want to now update multiple state, this process is asynchronous, and it makes a lot of sense that this is the way it is, because you don't want to constantly update the UI every time that you update the state. All right, you want to do that is per batch. So that was very important, at least to understand and be able to describe now what React is doing. I do think this is great. And also is when it comes to work or some gotchas here when it comes to work with the user state. So for example is, hey, you can provide now an initial function, okay, that say, hey, this is only run once when the application is running. So this is useful, for example, you want to load some data from your local store and then populate that when the app is loading. And the other is the, how do you call it here? Exactly. And the other is and the other is that the gotcha when you now pass is undefined and or empty values or string values. So this is preferred to always pass now in a string value if you need to, right? So in any case, so then we look at which is something that it doesn't describe here, and I do find that that's very important, because not only that, as a UI developers, we always want to deal with rendering a list of elements or a form, which I do find that there is quite important that they add some stuff here, right? Queuing a series of state updates. Exactly. Exactly. So they don't mention anything with that, especially to work with forms. I do think they should work with it. Form hooks for components. Using information returned by a form action. Oh, there you got it. Exactly. Use action state. My actions can no longer read the submitted form data. Up, optimistically updating forms. Mm-hmm. But again, this is because most of the time, that's what we do. Calling a server function outside a form. Resetting a form with a key. Preserving and resetting a state. And there you got it. Use form status. Oh, this is a hook here. In React 19, you do have that. A lot of people actually are in React 18, not in React 19 as it is. Right? Okay. Okay. Oh. Oh. React versions. And there you got it. Use form status. This is a hook for this particular action. Okay, but again, all of these are very specific to work with forms. But most of the time, we're going to work with forms is via that. So form hooks, form components, form hooks and form components. There you got it. Deferring formatting of the debug value. Optimistically updating form. Well, in any case, yeah, what are you looking for? That's a good question. Form hooks. Built-in React DOM hooks. Programmatic React features, hooks, components, APIs, and directives. Hooks, components, API, clients API, and server API. React compiler is a built-in optimization tool that automatically memoizes your React components and values. Configuration, directive, compiling libraries. The React compiler, interesting. Hey, this is something that I don't think in React 18 you do have that. This is a reference. And the rules of React. You see? Okay. Interesting. The React compiler is a built-in optimization tool that automatically memoizes your React components and values. That's interesting. So you don't have to use use Memo, all right? For that, it automatically going to detect which component needs are candidates to be memoized, aka to be stored to prevent some computations. But the question is components and values. There you got it. Okay, legacy apps exported from React package, but not recommended for using newly written code. Okay, and easily plugging React rules and all this kind of stuff. and then React DOM and React DOM. Okie dokie, bro. And this is on React 18. React calls components and hooks, and rule of hooks. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Okay. Good. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Um. Yeah. Give me a second. I'll be right back. All right, and we're back. So, because now we went through the React versions and understand now, for example, is the React compiler just a little bit. But I do think that the more we can now understand is this particularly doc. All right. Nope. The React def, right? So the more we're able to understand uh, these sections and also the reference as well, the better off will be for ourselves, or in my case, for myself, right? As a way to be to describe what are the things, what is the anatomy of React. Okay, so because we were, so I was talking about the working with forms and the everyone favorite topics about forms, and because when you define a form with different inputs, because there is no convention on how each one of them uh, do this data binding, which is a way of how now we collect the value based on the user inputs, text, style, color, range, or uh, check boxes or radio buttons or select, right? And text and context and text area. So each one of those inputs handles quite different. So most likely the inputs, the select, and the radio on and the radio buttons, right? So because now with React we have this convenient pattern of how we can attach and listen for events, this data binding. All right, in other frameworks out there, you have, for example, a specific directive uh, that handles that for us, which makes a lot of sense. For example, in the case of Vue with Vue model, as well as a Angular, I do have a lot of time not knowing what Angular is. To me, Angular was, I just leave Angular when it was version 2. So look at this. There's a lot of versions here. Uh, and most likely most application must be is in here, working with this. Yeah, Angular 16, Angular 19, and Angular 18. Okay. And Angular 16, and they don't actually link other previous version. Interesting. Angular 15 remains the same. Angular 14 as well. What about 13? What about 12? What about 11? This is our okay. Achieve documentation for Angular 12. Please visit angular.io. This is now archived to that. 11, 10. Holy moly. I live 8. Holy moly. 20 or 5. Holy hell. This is archive documentation for Angular 5. Holy, you know, that's this. So my last time was to 2010, 2017. This is one of the reasons why when you work with Google products, so some of these Google products, they don't long live. And that's a shame, bro. That's a shame that all of these Google products, they don't survive. And if they don't survive, to me it's like, okay. Test drive Angular material 22 components now in beta. Try it now. Holy hell, man. It's like the decision they have made has, you know, all of this. Holy hell. Moly moly, bro. It's now Angular 18. So again, in the case of Angular, I do know that this goes beyond the scope of today's video, all right? But I just wanted to look at the similarities when dealing with this data binding, for example, with Vue as well. So when you do have now Vue, make AI your Vue coding partner. For example, here in Vue, the guide here on form inputs binding, you know, even that they have a specific section here. That's quite interesting. The same for Angular as well. But in the case of Angular, you say, hey, this is the tutorial, right? You say, hey, this is how they now render something. And what they did is just using is plain JavaScript, all right? Describe this component as a function decorator, right? That is going to add some wait, what? Oh, okay, there's some problem there. But this is some decorators, and this is a particular pattern, is to enhance the functionality of this class. And it's interesting because this is a design pattern. This is not something that I invented. So for example, this design pattern of this is when you want to enhance the functionality of an object, not a behavior. This is an structural. The decorator, exactly. So it's a structural design pattern that lets you attach new behaviors to objects by placing these objects inside of a special wrappers. Object that contains the behaviors. So what it's doing is now is placing this particularly wrappers around this. So you have the notifier that wrap this SMS, Facebook notifier, Slack notifier, and each notification type is implemented as a notifier subclass, right? SMS, my Slack notifier, so on and so forth. So inheritance versus aggregations. Wrapper is an alternative nickname for the decorator pattern that clearly expresses the main idea of a pattern. A wrapper is an object that can be linked with some target objects. Then the wrapper contains the same set of methods as the target delegates to all requests it receives. However, the wrapper may alter the result by doing something either before or after pass the request to the target. So in other words, the real world analogy, you get a combined effect from wearing multiple pieces of clothing. Okay, like a decorator. So you're adding now is behavior to an existing. So this again, this is when you want to attach exactly new behaviors on objects inside of a special wrappers, which is what it's doing here. Hey, this decorator, I want to now add this special behavior to this object known as class that it contains this. The question will be is this, what this component will have. So if I say this, what this component will have. It's a console, it's a clear but never in the terminal. But if I re-render this, no, doesn't re-render. Initializing dev server. Wait, what? Oh, because it's initializing the dev server. This is building, and now you get this. What if we say this? Change detected, loaded, but it doesn't trigger anything. What about here? Load time. But it doesn't output anything here in the console. Oh, there you go. There you go. Here. Okay, so let's go into say class app component. So what is this? What is this? Okay, like so. So what is this? So you have now this class component, right? But it say this is now an app component, which is an object here, and then it points to this. Yeah, this is an app class, but how can I look at what is this behind the scenes, right? Can you expose that? Can you tell me what it is? Can you tell me what is this object look like? Because here is just pointing to that. And don't get me wrong, but I do want to know what in the French toast is that, bro. Again, this is not a course of Angular. All right. But what we are doing here, um, that'll be a very interesting segue here to take. Um, yeah, that'll be a very interesting segue to take. But I think this is not relevant for us, especially with code. Mm, or where I can test this code. I think we have some alternative like Go Blinders and so on and so forth. Instance no setup. Exactly. Go Bliss stack. Bliss stack Bliss. Okay. In Code Sandbox or Stack Bliss. Okay, but I do want to know is what is this? The app here. So what is this? Let me check that out in the console. It say, hey, this is now a function. Okay, so now this is a function. Interesting. So this becomes now a function. So a class is not a function. If I want to now create a new instance of this function, it say, hey, this now generate is this export. Because this is a function. So it's this, the prototype app, but it doesn't allow me to look forward. Just like this. It doesn't allow me to continue to link or go in to understand this. How can I check the prototype from the Again, I know that this might go beyond the scope of this, but this is object get prototype off. It's a, well, give me now is that. It's a, hey, object get prototype of this new instance, which is now an object. Okay. And what if I want to look at the, what if I want to look, interesting. What if I want to look, oh, because this is, okay. What if I want to look now at these components here? And by this component is this. Okay. Object of prototype, get prototype of new app. But if I do want to get this, it say, hey, you just only have a name. All of that. You just only have a name. Mm-hmm. And what these things mean here. Now this is when it creates this the state and the value. Now it creates this object that contains the some symbol, state, and the value, prototype of some aware promise. So if I do get the object dot get prototype of to actually know uh, where are this object being delegated is in a promise. Ah, holy fuck. Mm-hmm. Okay. Hmm. But it's interesting because this app in itself is just only contains the name when you create that. Or in fact, this is a function. A class is now a function, but it doesn't describe anything about this. You know, it doesn't describe anything about this. We'd say that this is a decorator factory to enhance this this to this. And the other is a bootstrap application, which now is a function that is going to call that as it is. So I do think that view provider model like this, string URL, but again, this is very specific to Angular. And the way how now deal, because all of it was to how now Angular deal with this data binding. So when you do look at the directive and attributes directive, structural directive, and so on and so forth, signals, Angular signals is a system that granularly track how and where your state is used throughout an application, allowing the framework to optimize rendering updates. Mm-hmm. And this is a concept from Angular here. When they say, hey, let's going to now define this, signals are getter functions, and calling them reads their value. And to change the value to a writable signal, you do is this. And computed signals. This is interesting because at the end of the day, what has been now effective in solving this particular problem is React. Okay. That's interesting. What has been shown that this is effective is React. Input signals and model inputs. So what's Angular? Okay, and when it comes to work with form, because that's what it is, so you have reactive forms, strictly tied reactive form, templated driven forms, validate for inputs, and building dynamic forms. Exactly. So for example, using is this ng model and form control and so on and so forth. Form control, or using this special syntax here of the ng model. Create and manage a form control instance for that. And the favorite color is this. And data flow informs. Type the input, fire the input event. And there is a lot of company using now Angular for that, because making a simple change has shown a pain in the ass. This is all about this. Making a small change. Oh, grab it. Making this is merchants of complexity, bro. In real life. Merchants of complexity, man. Oh, grab. Merchants of complexity, man. Okay. Because at the end of what I'm looking here is that look at all of this different form group, form control. Look at all of these things needs to be in place in order for us to create now a UI elements here to describe this. To describe a serve form data and submit is because at the end of the day you now are using a lot of the things to create now, because at the end of the day the goal is to create now that HTML element, bro, and work with that group of nested forms in templates, for example, like this. And updating part of the data model here, updating profile, this dot profile form dot patch values. Exactly. So get that instance and let's go to now attach that. But again, it's because, oh my god, it's because, holy hell. It's because now with Angular it exposes specific components to control each one of them in order to create a form programmatically. Exactly, in order to create a form programmatically, and then to validate a form input as well, like this. Make a field require. You say, hey, this is the set of validators and so on and so forth. But all of this is, again, unlike GSX or unlike React, where the idea here is to where the idea here is to, holy hell, just build a simple form, display the form array in the templates. So you have now another directive that lets you say, hey, let me iterate through this collections of elements. But this is one of the things that I find out very powerful of GSX, is that the template engines that all other language out there, for example, PHP or Ruby, PHP, for example, with Laravel, you have Blade, or Ruby with Shopify is the um, Liquid, and now in Node, in JavaScript you have now Node, that there is no template engine because it's JavaScript. It's now how the browser is going to interpret that. I do find this is much this so you don't have to learn is a specific interesting. You don't have to learn a specific very, very interesting. You don't have to learn a very specific template language to work to simply create those user interface and populate the data from the database. You don't have to do that. You just only need to know deeply is the standard, the platform, JavaScript. Okay. Okay. And in the case here of Vue, it say, hey, because Vue behaves somewhat with Angular and React, but here is now a reactive rendering system. So behind the scenes, what you gotta do is to keep track all of these states for you, all right, uh, and update that when they need it. Mm-hmm. So exactly, and update that when and update it the specific UI when they need it. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And I do why now a lot of people actually go with React rather than Vue or Angular to build these small applications. Hmm. Because at the end of the day, all of this framework, what they're doing is just uh, cooler, faster ways to rendering engine, to rendering elements on the server, populated dynamically, and then served to the client. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Okay. 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 Hmm. So I do get why a lot of people actually are looking for Angular developers and so on and so forth. Mhm. So this is why you, well, very very interesting. This is you as a developer. You choose your tools based on the market, bro. That's this is very very interesting um, to look at it, to understand what is the problem they are solving, especially with forms, and that at the end of the day, what you want to do is now is control is the state of that UI small by relying on existing on stuff that exists, right? By relying on stuff that exists. Hmm. Angular routing and so on and so forth. In common routing task. Exactly, because now you're going to do the routing here. You have routing, you have forms, you have HTTP clients, you have performance, you have testing, and so on and so forth. But that's why I stop. Why? That's why I hit the break with forms and routing here. Okay. Routing helps you change what the user see in a single page app. Exactly. And the other is signals. Angular Signal is a system that granularly track how and where your state is used throughout an application, allowing the framework to optimize the rendering updates. To check out the Angular Essential before the compressive guideline here. Managing dynamic data. Composing with components. Exactly. So create your components in this particular way. Uh, Separating HTML and CSS in separate files like this and using a component. And if you want to import a component, you say, hey, is this to-do list items? And then you're going to render that. Manage it, but here you are going to do is all on top of the decorator. Mm-hmm. Managing dynamic data. Here, tiki, managing dynamic data to update the state. You define your state here, and this is complete to true, and update title here as it is. And managing dynamic data here. The other is rendering dynamic templates. Rendering dynamic templates like this. Okay, in dynamic properties, form is invalid. So it's going to map that and dynamic attribute in the next step. And then you have the conditional and loops here. One of the advantages of using a framework like Angular is that it provides built-in solution for common problems. This conditional and rendering is that now the language or the framework, it needs to provide this. Look at this. It needs to provide is this sort of it needs to provide this sort of template engines or this specific template language to do basic stuff, that instead of using now JavaScript, you have to rely on these specific behaviors. Handling user interactions is another one. Okay, what we're talking about here is that how do you handle now these things and so on and so forth, and create user.event. And then now sharing logic, sharing code or dependency injections here. Exactly. And then the next step here. But as we look at this, holy moly. Okay. Holy moly. Managing dynamic data here. Exactly. So what is a state? Component lets you neatly encapsulate responsibility for the script part of your application. For example, a sign up form. And here's this defining component state and behaviors to manage dynamic data. Now that we have learned the basic structure of a component, let's learn how you can define the component data, state, and behaviors. So for example, a sign up form component might need to keep track of whether the form is valid or not before allowing users to take a specific action. This is a common problem for all of these frameworks, whether it's jQuery, Angular, Vue, React, you name it. As a result, the various property that a component needs to track is often referred to as a state. So to define a state, you use the class field syntax here inside of your components. For example, using the to-do list item component, create two properties that you want to track here. And then if you want to update that, you just define it as behaviors. Exactly. And if you want to respond to this event or attach to this event, which is in this, well, you can now is attach that state to this. So by the time that this internally is being called, it's going to now generate the proper p tag that match is this. So for example, in this case here, so you are defining is the state here, and when now this component gets mounted, it's going to now is attach these elements into the DOM with now the name properly rendering here or interpolated. Okay, diggy. Okay. Holy hell, man. That'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye. Okay.